Chapter 3, her jeans were soaked up to her knees, her jacket was oversized, and her hat floppy and wet against her head. The woman on his doorstep looked like she just scaled Mount Everest and had the wind-chapped cheeks, to prove it. Or no, not Mount Everest, because someone scaling him out and would have known to dress for the weather conditions. This woman was in sneakers. She was lucky she didn't have a broken leg to show for her troubles. He wasn't keen on the idea of letting a stranger into his home, not when someone had tried to kill him just a handful of hours ago, but hell, it was a nightmare. Outside, he couldn't stomach the thought of leaving anyone out there. If his guards had been on hand, they would have stopped him, but with Jim and John, he had no idea what their birth names were and had no desire to learn them either, so they were always just Jim and John. Even when they were replaced, not around, there wasn't anyone to stop him from letting her in. Besides, if she did prove to be dangerous, he had Colby with him, and his dog had learned a few guard dog cues when he was a puppy. Oh, who was he kidding? Colby would probably just lick her to death. The dog didn't have a mean bone in his body. George would just have to hope that the woman's cute and innocent act wasn't a ruse to get him to let his guard down if she was part of the plot that had sent him to the cabin in the first place. Surely she was the worst assassin ever, showing up on his doorstep all bedraggled and half frozen. Plus she was too cute to be a killer. Red cheeks, and all, she was shivering beneath all of her layers and could barely sputter out the request to use his phone. Reluctantly, George pushed back against the door and allowed her inside, all the while vowing that she would stay no longer than it would take for someone to come get her and for her to become their problem. He hung the girl's coat and turned to lead her to the phone, but he found himself caught off guard as he faced her. He'd assumed this was a girl of just 20 years old, perhaps a year or two older, but with her outerwear out of the way, he now realized that she was much closer to his age and carried it well. Once she stripped off her head, he realized that his initial snap judgment of her had been wrong. She was much more than cute. The woman who'd landed on his porch in the middle of a blizzard was downright gorgeous, with cut glass cheekbones and full lips. He couldn't stop watching. Her brown hair had been tied in a bun and stuffed under her hat, but now several curly tendrils fought to be free. Her green eyes met his defiantly, as if it didn't matter that he'd allowed her into his home. He smiled internally at this, intrigued by the fact that she didn't seem intimidated by nor interested in him. If it was an act, she was certainly selling it well, and if it wasn't, well, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? He couldn't remember the last time he'd met a woman who wasn't either cowed by him or drawn to him. He pointed her to the phone and handed her a phone book before walking out with a beer in hand. He settled in the living room as he overheard her conversation with the towing company. "Hello, hello, can you hear me?" she was nearly yelling now. There was a pause as the woman waited for a response. "Yes, I'm sorry, there is an awful connection. I'm in need of a tow." Pause as someone spoke on the other end of the line. "My car is en route for about 2 miles east of Highway 65. George could hear the woman shuffle in the kitchen. "Yes, I understand, but I really need to have it pulled out." "That's it, it doesn't need to be taken anywhere. It should really only take a minute or two." Pause again and more shuffling as the woman found a chair and made herself comfortable. "Please, I know it's Christmas Eve and I know the weather is awful, but don't you have family that you'd like to spend Christmas with?" Short pause. "Well, I have family too, and I'd like to get home to them." He wasn't sure why, but something about the woman's last sentence sounded a bit off, not dishonest, but wrong, as if she wasn't actually all that excited to get home to her family. "Please." Her voice was lowered to merely a whisper, but he could hear the desperation in it. "Isn't there anything you can do tonight?" Silence as the person on the other line responded. When the woman spoke again, she sounded defeated. "Yes, I understand, thank you. Tomorrow." Pause. "Yes, thank you, I'll be there." Pause. "Yes, Merry Christmas to you as well." He could hear her exasperated sigh from where he was seated. George lounged back into his chair and sipped on his beer, scratching behind Colby's ears as the dog rested his head in George's lap, and both of them waited to see what the woman would do now. It took several minutes for her to drag her feet into the doorway of the kitchen. He looked up to her and put on an innocent expression. If she didn't realize that she'd been speaking loudly enough for him to overhear, then he wasn't going to enlighten her. "Any luck?" he asked. Colby looked between the two of them. Like he was watching a tennis match, her eyes narrowed at him, but she kept her cool. No, but thank you for letting me use your phone. She turned on her heels and walked towards the coat rack, snatching her coat, wrapping her scarf around herself and pulling on her hat. George watched inquisitively, wondering if the woman was stubborn and proud enough that she'd risk spending the night out in the cold rather than ask his assistance. She faced him as she zipped up her large coat and slipped into her gloves. I appreciate you allowing me to make a call. I hope you have a Merry Christmas. Her hand was on the handle, turning it and pulling the door open before he finally spoke. You know that I can't let you go back out there, it's too dangerous unless help is coming right away, and you just said that it's not so given that. Would you like to join me for dinner? I have enough for two. Colby thumped his tail on the couch as if he understood that he was about to have a new playmate for the night. The door closed slowly, quietly, but the woman kept her hand on the handle as if she was prepared to sprint away at any moment. As if she was afraid that if she turned around and released the doorknob, she would never be able to leave. George found himself feeling a little offended by her attitude. He may not have the greatest reputation, but that was because women complained that he moved on too quickly, not because he forced anyone to stay with him when they wanted to leave. And anyway, that wasn't what his offer was about. As beautiful as she was, he had no designs on her. He wasn't all that interested in being close to anyone at the moment, not after the recent attempt on his life. That was why he'd come out here in the first place. He was supposed to be in hiding, making sure that no one knew where to find him until the threat against him was resolved. Having this woman stay overnight was the dead opposite of what he'd resolved to do, and he knew that Jim and John would give him hell for it if they found out. In spite of that, though, he knew that he had to make the offer, especially when the alternative was sending her to her car to freeze overnight. It wasn't like there was anywhere nearby that he could drop her to wait it out until morning. The nearest motel was 20 miles away, and like hell was he driving 20 miles there and back on these roads in this kind of storm. No, it made the most sense for both of them for her to stay, and maybe if he played his cards right, he could turn her bad luck into his good spin. Let it slip to the press that he let a wayward wanderer crash at his place on a snowy holiday. It was what he did best, turning misfortune into an opportunity.